Integrity is the ultimate load-bearing structure. It is the invisible steel within the concrete, designed to flex under the crushing weight of greed without ever breaking. But in the modern architecture of power, that ancient foundation is being quietly replaced by the fragile, pixelated nature of a digital lie. A single corrupted bit can dismantle an empire before the dust even has time to settle. While the world gathers to admire the masterful brushstrokes of a forged canvas, the true warfare is waged in the silent, encrypted void beneath the paint. A lie told in code is a blade that cuts without bleeding. It turns a priceless masterpiece into a Trojan horse, and a multi-billion-dollar promise into a lethal trap waiting for a single keystroke. High above the Chicago skyline, the auction house's private VIP balcony was a hushed, metallic world suspended in the dark. Below, the city's elite gathered, completely oblivious to the silent financial assassination happening right above them. Carolyn C. Ryan sat rigidly, feeling the suffocating pressure of a multi-billion-dollar crime unfolding in plain sight. Young-Ho Yeo stood over her shoulder, his midnight blue tuxedo radiating a cold, predatory dominance as her fingers hovered over a glowing forensic tablet. Stay with me until the end. Because how she dismantled his empire with a single keystroke left every rival, every lieutenant, and every man in his syndicate absolutely speechless. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Hidden Mafia Chronicles, and comment where you're watching from. Carolyn had not always existed in the shadows of the city's elite. Before the emerald evening blazer and the terrifying weight of the Korean syndicate's demands, she had been a formidable architect of truth. Just 3 years ago, she was a senior associate at the most ruthless cyber forensics firm in the Midwest. And she dismantled encrypted corporate lies for breakfast and built impenetrable digital fortresses by lunch. She was brilliant, highly visible, and entirely untouchable, until she wasn't. Her downfall had not been a clumsy accident. It was a clinical, surgical demolition. A massive data leak during a high-stakes arbitration had been masterfully traced back to her personal terminal. The digital trail was flawless, the fabricated evidence undeniable. Now, it was the kind of sophisticated frame job that only a phantom army of elite hackers could execute. Overnight, her stellar reputation dissolved into toxic ash. She was stripped of her security clearances, professionally exiled, and legally paralyzed by the ensuing litigation. Cast out of the corporate world, Carolyn was forced into a grayscale existence. She traded her high-altitude corner office for the windowless, unlisted basements of the city's underground art appraisal circuit. No, it was the only arena that didn't ask questions, the only place desperate enough to utilize her unique ability to authenticate the digital twins of priceless artifacts off the books. But sheer survival was not her only burden. She was anchored to the crushing weight of a $500,000 debt, the lingering ruins of her late father's discredited art gallery. The relentless creditors did not care about her ruined career. They only cared about the remaining balance. No, that quiet desperation was the weak joint in her foundation, the microscopic crack that allowed the cold in. It was the exact vulnerability that a predator like Young-Ho Yeo had meticulously mapped out before he ever made contact. He didn't just find her, he calculated her. He knew she needed the capital to finally bury her father's ghosts, and he knew the legitimate world had permanently locked its doors to her. Like when the man in the bespoke midnight blue tuxedo had first appeared in her dim basement office, offering an astronomical sum for a single night of authentication, she had felt the trap closing. But a starving ghost cannot refuse a lifeline, even if it is woven with barbed wire. The trap was not in the brushstrokes. It was buried deep within the microscopic architecture of the pixels. When Carolyn had first powered on her transparent forensic tablet to authenticate the supposed lost Renaissance masterpiece, she expected the usual high society fraud. She anticipated forged provenance papers or a brilliant chemical replication of 16th century pigments. But as the digital twin of the painting rendered across her screen, illuminating her tense features in the dim light of the VIP balcony, she realized the canvas itself was entirely irrelevant, and the physical art sitting under the stage lights was nothing more than a lavish, highly publicized distraction. Her trained eyes analyzed the cryptographic hash, securing the digital certificate of authenticity. To the corrupt auction director and the oblivious billionaires sipping champagne below, The file was just a standard, modern guarantee of ownership. But Carolyn's fingers danced across the glass, peeling back the superficial image to expose its raw alphanumeric skeleton. There, hidden within the darkest gradients of the digital oil paint, was the subtle twist. It was a breathtaking piece of steganography. Someone had weaponized the masterpiece's code, seamlessly weaving a massive, heavily encrypted ledger into the visual data. The sheer scale of the hidden architecture made her breath catch in her throat. This was not a simple tax evasion scheme. It was the financial nervous system of an underworld empire. Whilst the ledger was meticulously designed to automatically execute a smart contract the exact moment the auctioneer's hammer fell, it would instantly launder over $1 billion in cryptocurrency, scattering the funds across thousands of untraceable offshore nodes under the guise of an art sale. The winning bid was merely the trigger mechanism. Young-Ho Yo was not buying a painting. He was executing a massive money laundering operation in plain sight, turning a violent syndicate's demand into a polite, legally binding request for $1 billion transfer. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The Korean syndicate had not hired her to spot a fake. They had hired her pristine, albeit ruined, forensic credentials to publicly legitimize the digital vessel carrying their virus. If she authenticated the file, she became the architect of their ultimate victory. If she refused, the predator standing just inches behind her would ensure she never left the balcony alive. The air in the VIP balcony shifted, growing impossibly heavy as Young-Ho Yo closed the final inch of distance between them. He did not loom like a common street thug. He occupied space with the terrifying absolute certainty of a man who owned the atmosphere itself. His bespoke midnight blue velvet tuxedo seemed to absorb the dim light, a sartorial black hole that masked the lethal, coiled energy beneath. Night he smelled of cold rain, aged bourbon, and the faint metallic tang of ozone, a sensory contradiction that perfectly mirrored his dual nature. Yo was not an artifact of the old underworld, ruling through crude violence and rusted weapons. He was a modern apex predator, an underboss whose power was rendered exponentially more terrifying by his cold, flawless comprehension of the digital realm. He understood that a bullet could only end a single life. But a corrupted string of code could erase an entire bloodline's legacy before dawn. As he leaned intimately over Carolyn's shoulder, the faint silver scar cutting through his left eyebrow caught the harsh blue glow of her forensic tablet. It was the only physical testament to the blood he had spilled to ascend to a throne built on encryption. He did not need to press a gun to her ribs. The threat was absolute and atmospheric. Yo slowly raised his left wrist, the crisp cuff of his unbuttoned black silk shirt sliding back to reveal a sleek, matte black smartwatch. On its face, a cryptically loading progress bar synced perfectly with the waterfall of alphanumeric code, reflecting in Carolyn's widened eyes. He was not just watching her work. He was auditing her keystrokes in real time. "The architecture is flawless, is it not, Ms. Ryan?" Yo murmured. His voice was a low, melodic hum that vibrated with sophisticated menace. He casually tapped his polished wooden auction paddle, bearing the number 007 against his palm. The soft, rhythmic, slapping sound served as a hypnotic metronome, ticking down to her point of no return. He knew exactly what she had just discovered inside the Renaissance digital twin. The arrogant, faint smirk playing on his lips confirmed it. Yo was fully aware he had handed her a loaded digital weapon, or completely confident that the crushing weight of her ruined past would force her to pull the trigger for his empire. The suffocating tension between Carolyn and the underboss did not exist in a vacuum. Just a few feet away, lingering by the heavy velvet drapes that shielded the balcony exit, Steve J. Jones was quietly falling apart. The auction director, a man who had spent 3 decades cultivating an aura of untouchable patrician elegance, was currently unraveling under the dim, recessed lighting. He dabbed frantically at his flushed, graying hairline with a crumpled white silk handkerchief, his eyes wide and glassy with a rapidly rising panic. For years, Steve had considered himself a master of the gray area. He had built his prestigious auction house into a global powerhouse by knowing exactly when to look the other way. He had brokered quiet deals for oligarchs and fenced questionable antiquities for exiled royals. and always taking his exorbitant cut with a polite smile and a pristine black and white tuxedo. When Young-ho Yo's associates had first approached him with a highly lucrative proposition to fast-track the sale of a newly discovered Renaissance masterpiece, Steve's overconfidence had completely blinded him. He had eagerly opened his gilded doors to the Korean syndicate, arrogantly assuming he was facilitating a standard, albeit high-priced, money-washing operation. While he thought he was playing the role of the house, and the house always won. But as he watched the brilliant, disgraced cyber expert frantically working the transparent tablet under Yo's lethal gaze, Steve finally understood the catastrophic scale of his miscalculation. He was not the house. He was simply the doormat. The digital twin Carolyn was authenticating wasn't just a clever forgery meant to fool an eccentric billionaire. It was a billion-dollar cryptographic bomb. And his prestigious auction house was ground zero. If international authorities traced the massive blockchain ledger hidden within the painting's pixels, they wouldn't just find the syndicate's ghosts. They would find Steve's signature on every compliance document, his secure servers hosting the transfer, and his legacy utterly complicit in the largest digital laundering scheme in history. He looked down at his trembling hands, the silk handkerchief now damp with cold sweat. His reflection caught in the polished brass railing of the balcony, revealing a stark, pathetic truth. His usually immaculate bow tie was visibly crooked, resting askew against his collar, a glaring, physical manifestation of his crumbling authority. Steve J. Jones, the titan of the legitimate art world, had eagerly invited an apex predator into his sanctuary, and now he was nothing more than a terrified, unwilling auditor to his own grand betrayal. He could only stand in the shadows, not paralyzed by the consequences of his own greed, waiting for the hammer to fall. The genius of the syndicate's trap lay in its breathtaking subtlety. As Carolyn's fingers glided across the smooth glass of her forensic tablet, she didn't see the delicate, sweeping brush strokes of a Renaissance master. She saw a vast, digital ocean of manipulation. The heist was a masterclass in modern steganography, the ancient art of hiding a secret message in plain sight. He updated for an era where billions of dollars could vanish in a millisecond. The digital twin of the masterpiece was an ultra-high-resolution file, a composite of billions of individual pixels designed to perfectly replicate the physical painting sitting under the auction house lights. But Young-ho Yo's ghost army of coders had weaponized the image's immense size. Means they had executed a highly sophisticated, least significant bit substitution, a technique that subtly altered the numerical color value of a fraction of the pixels. To the naked eye of an oligarch or an eccentric art collector, the deep, rich crimson of a painted velvet drape remained completely undisturbed. But to the decryption algorithm currently running on Carolyn's screen, those imperceptible shifts in color formed a sprawling, hidden architecture. It was poison administered in an elegant drop. Instead of a crude bank hack that would immediately trigger international alarms, the syndicate had embedded a fully functional, decentralized cryptocurrency ledger directly into the visual data of the art. Carolyn watched the waterfall of green alphanumeric code tumble down her screen, dissecting the anatomy of the crime. The file contained thousands of automated smart contracts, dormant strings of logic waiting for a specific digital key to wake them up. When the auctioneer's hammer finally fell, the winning bid would act as that precise key. The legitimate transfer of ownership for the physical painting would simultaneously execute the hidden code, instantly distributing over $1 billion in illicit funds across a labyrinth of untraceable global accounts. The sheer elegance of the malware was terrifying. It bypassed every traditional financial firewall because no one was looking for a bank heist inside an exclusive auction catalog. Yo had turned the entire high society art market into a blind mule for his criminal enterprise. Carolyn felt a cold bead of sweat slide down her temple, the physical manifestation of her impossible predicament. If she pressed the glowing confirmation icon on her tablet, she would permanently validate the file, unlocking the steganographic ledger into the blockchain as a legitimate asset. She would be handing the Mafia the keys to an invisible, unstoppable financial engine. But as she stared at the lethal beauty of the code under the suffocating presence of the underboss, her brilliant analytical mind began to map the microscopic weaknesses within the syndicate's perfect digital armor. The heavy velvet curtains below parted with a soft, theatrical whisper, And the auctioneer stepped up to the mahogany podium. Instantly, the ambient murmur of the Chicago elite dissolved into a reverent, breathless silence. Under the blinding halogen spotlights of the main stage, the Renaissance masterpiece looked tragically fragile, an ancient ghost paraded before wolves. But to Carolyn, sitting rigid in the shadowed VIP balcony, the physical painting was nothing more than an ornate detonator. Ladies and gentlemen, the auctioneer's voice boomed through the pristine acoustic space, smooth and polished like wet marble. We arrive at the pinnacle of our evening. The bidding commenced, not with a chaotic shout, but with a terrifyingly civilized rhythm. It was a hypnotic staccato chant that immediately began to dictate the pace of Carolyn's own racing heart. 70 million. A polite nod from the third row. 85 million. A gently raised catalog near the aisle. The numbers flying through the air were astronomical, yet they were entirely meaningless. A beautifully choreographed piece of theater designed to mask the billion-dollar cryptographic payload waiting in the dark. With every escalating bid, the thrum of the room grew denser, a suffocating physical pressure that pressed against Carolyn's ribs. The auctioneer's rhythmic cadence became a ticking clock, mercilessly counting down the seconds of her indecision. Her finger hovered a fraction of an inch above the glowing green confirmation icon on the transparent glass of her tablet. To press it was to surrender completely, to permanently lock the syndicate's steganographic ledger into the blockchain and wash away her father's debts with dirty, invisible money. It was the safe choice. It was the coward's choice. Behind her, Young-Ho Yo shifted his weight. The faint rustle of his midnight blue velvet jacket sounded louder than the quiet murmurs of the crowd below. He did not need to speak to remind her of the stakes. His silence was an executioner's promise. He was waiting for her to break, anticipating that the sheer, crushing magnitude of the moment would force her trembling finger down onto the glass. 120 million. The auctioneer's voice spiked in pitch, sensing the climax approaching. Carolyn's pulse thudded violently in her ears, synchronizing perfectly with the relentless upward climb of the bids. The legitimate art world was eagerly financing its own corruption, and she was the only person in the building who could see the invisible architecture of the crime. The hammer was going to fall. The trap was going to snap shut. As the bidding crested toward its preordained peak, the crushing weight of her ruined past collided with a sudden freezing spark of defiance. Carolyn stopped looking at the glowing confirmation button, gritted her teeth, and dragged her analytical eyes back into the raw, cascading waterfall of encrypted code. The sound began as a soft, rhythmic whisper, barely audible beneath the booming voice of the auctioneer. Young-Ho Yo was rhythmically tapping the edge of his polished wooden auction paddle against the palm of his left hand. In the suffocating isolation of the VIP balcony, the noise quickly amplified into a menacing drone. It was a calculated psychological metronome designed to fracture Carolyn's remaining resolve. With every strike of wood against flesh, a microscopic vibration traveled down through the metallic floorboards, creeping up through the soles of her shoes and settling deep into her bones. Yeo did not look at the stage. His cold, predatory gaze remained fixed entirely on the side of Carolyn's face, studying the tension pulling her jaw tight. He was a master of invisible leverage, when using the physical space and the agonizing ticking of the paddle to crush the air out of her lungs. The tapping was a promise of violence, perfectly synchronized with the escalating numbers echoing from the mahogany podium below. 140 million is with the gentleman in the fourth row, the auctioneer declared, his polished voice trembling with the thrill of a record-breaking night. Do I hear 150? The tapping abruptly stopped. And the sudden absence of the sound was somehow more terrifying than the drone itself. Carolyn felt the atmospheric pressure in the balcony violently drop as Yo shifted his weight. The midnight blue velvet of his tuxedo brushed against the back of her emerald blazer, an intimate, chilling reminder of her physical vulnerability. He stepped forward to the heavy brass railing, leaning over the precipice of the balcony where the spotlight's periphery could just barely catch him. Slowly, not with the casual arrogance of a king claiming his tribute, Yo raised paddle number 007 into the air. A collective gasp rippled through the elite crowd below as the auctioneer's eyes darted up to the shadows of the VIP box. 150 million, the auctioneer breathed, his voice echoing through the pristine acoustics. "A new bid from the gallery." Yeo lowered the paddle and turned his head slightly, his dark eyes locking onto Carolyn's glowing screen. The final bid had been placed, and the trigger mechanism for the billion-dollar cryptocurrency transfer was now fully engaged. All that remained was for the disgraced expert to digitally authenticate the masterpiece, locking the steganographic ledger into the blockchain forever. His smartwatch illuminated, a cryptically loading progress bar waiting for her compliance. Yo offered a faint, chilling smile that did not reach his eyes. It was no longer a negotiation. The drone had ended, but then the executioner was simply waiting for her to finalize her own ruin. The glowing green confirmation button pulsed on the transparent glass of Carolyn's tablet, a digital guillotine waiting for her touch. Young-ho Yo's reflection hovered just above the screen, a phantom of midnight blue velvet and cold expectation. He anticipated a single defeated tap, the final surrender of a broken woman. Instead, Carolyn's hands began to move. It started with a subtle shift in posture, when the microscopic trembling in her shoulders completely vanished, replaced by the rigid, terrifying stillness of an apex predator that had finally found its angle of attack. She did not reach for the confirmation icon. Instead, her fingers initiated a silent ballet across the glass keyboard. It was a flawless execution of muscle memory, forged in the high-altitude corporate cyber wars she had once commanded. Her keystrokes were a blur, entirely silent but devastatingly precise, as she bypassed the primary authentication layer and dove straight into the raw, alphanumeric skeleton of the steganographic ledger. Yo frowned, his posture stiffening as the smartwatch on his wrist vibrated. The cryptically loading progress bar stuttered. He leaned in closer, the scent of ozone and bourbon wrapping around her like a vice, but the sheer blinding speed of her inputs rendered the cascading green code incomprehensible even to his tech-savvy eyes. She wasn't just reading the syndicate's smart contracts, she was actively dissecting them. With the clinical detachment of a surgeon, Carolyn located the specific string of cryptographic logic that dictated the routing of the billion-dollar transfer. The Mafia's code was undeniably elegant, designed to scatter the funds across thousands of untraceable offshore nodes the exact moment the auctioneer's hammer fell. But elegance is inherently fragile. With a few rapid surgical keystrokes, Carolyn introduced a microscopic flaw, a digital parasite she had meticulously built during the agonizing hours in her basement office, praying she would have the courage to use it. She uncorked the virus. It slipped into the syndicate's pristine ledger like a drop of venom into a bloodstream, completely invisible to the host program. In a matter of seconds, her rogue code began rewriting the destination addresses, silently overriding Yeo's vast network of dark accounts with a single, highly monitored international seizure node she had kept hidden in her arsenal since her days at the top-tier forensics firm. She was executing a flawless man-in-the-middle attack in real time, weaponizing the underboss's own masterpiece against him. The suffocating fear, the crushing debt of her father's failures, and the terrifying presence of the Korean Mafia boss dissolved into the pure crystalline logic of the hack. She was no longer a disgraced appraiser cowering in the shadows. She was the master of the board, building an inescapable digital trap right beneath their feet. Her fingers danced across the glass, steady and lethal, preparing the final override as the auctioneer's voice swelled to a triumphant crescendo below. The transparent glass of Carolyn's tablet became a mesmerizing theater of digital warfare. Where there had once been the static, arrogant architecture of the Korean syndicate's money laundering ledger, there was now a violent, cascading waterfall of green alphanumeric code. Her rogue virus tore through the steganographic layers with terrifying efficiency. It did not merely alter the destination of the funds, it actively hunted down the falsified reports of the syndicate's global wealth, dissolving decades of extortion, blood money, and illicit assets under the corrosive acid of her countercode. Young-ho Yo shifted closer, the oppressive weight of his presence bearing down on her shoulder. The faint, arrogant smirk that had previously anchored his sharp features began to slip. The sleek, matte black smartwatch on his wrist vibrated erratically, its cryptically loading progress bar fracturing into a series of jagged, unrecognizable errors. He was a master of the modern digital underworld, But in this exact fraction of a second, he was entirely blind. He assumed the rapid, a blinding blur of green text scrolling across her screen was the complex authentication protocol finally locking his billions into the blockchain. He did not realize he was watching the real-time demolition of his own empire. Carolyn didn't blink. Her sharp, analytical eyes tracked the microscopic shifts in the data stream, verifying that every single illicit node was being surgically severed and rerouted. The heavy, crushing debt that had tethered her to a grayscale existence evaporated with every line of code she overwrote. She was hollowing out the digital twin of the Renaissance masterpiece from the inside out, leaving the physical canvas below as nothing more than a worthless, heavily monitored trap for international authorities to spring. The elegant poison Yo had designed to infect the global market was now coursing backward through his own financial nervous system. Below them, now the pristine acoustics of the auction hall amplified the rising crescendo of the night. The elite crowd held its collective breath, completely mesmerized by the theater of the $150 million bid. The corrupt auction director, Steve J. Jones, gripped the edge of the velvet drapes, his knuckles white as he waited for the transaction that would forever stain his legacy. The auctioneer raised the polished mahogany hammer high into the air, the dramatic pause stretching the tension until it felt like the very glass of the VIP balcony might shatter. The trap was fully set, the digital heist had peaked, and the syndicate's wealth was securely locked inside a phantom ledger they could no longer control. Carolyn allowed her hands to finally lift from the glass, her lungs expanding as she prepared for the detonation. The mahogany hammer hung suspended in the brilliant, harsh light of the auction stage, in an agonizing, physical manifestation of the digital guillotine waiting above. The ambient noise of the Chicago elite had evaporated into a vacuum of pure, breathless anticipation. In the shadowed VIP balcony, Carolyn C. Ryan sat in the exact epicenter of the storm. The cascading waterfall of green alphanumeric code on her transparent tablet had stabilized into a rhythmic, pulsing terminal prompt. The counter-hack was fully armed. The syndicate's billions cleanly severed and rerouted into a heavily fortified international seizure node. But the final execution required one last manual confirmation, the literal press of a button to detonate the steganographic bomb. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability. Young-Ho Yo's presence shifted from suffocating to frantic. The sleek matte black smartwatch on his wrist was no longer vibrating. It was flashing a violent, rapid sequence of red error codes. The faint and arrogant smirk that had defined his sharp features was entirely gone, replaced by the rigid, terrifying realization of a predator that had just stepped into a snare. He leaned violently over her shoulder, the scent of cold rain and ozone sharpening into the metallic tang of pure adrenaline. His dark eyes darted frantically between the error messages on his wrist and the unfamiliar, pulsing terminal prompt on Carolyn's screen. "What is that?" Yeo hissed, his voice a low, unmelodic blade that vibrated with sudden, unmasked panic. "That is not the confirmation protocol. What did you do?" Carolyn did not flinch. The crushing, grayscale existence of her disgraced past fell away entirely. She was no longer the broken appraiser burdened by debt. She was the architect of his destruction. She leaned in closer to the glowing glass of the tablet, the blue light reflecting in her sharp, analytical eyes. She didn't speak to the underboss standing behind her. Instead, she whispered the truth directly to the network. Her fingers danced across the glass one final time, but she wasn't writing in the standard cryptographic logic Yeo's ghost army had anticipated. She switched effortlessly to a deeply embedded, archaic mainframe language, the exact highly classified syntax used by the international cyber forensics firm that had framed her 3 years ago. It was a language the Korean syndicate didn't think she knew how to weaponize, a brilliant or brutal signature that proved she wasn't just authenticating a forgery, she was taking back her name. Going once, the auctioneer's polished voice boomed through the pristine acoustics, his eyes locked onto the empty air where Yeo's paddle had just been raised. Carolyn typed the final command sequence, locking the syndicate's ghost accounts permanently and simultaneously blasting the decrypted steganographic ledger directly to the servers of Interpol and the SEC. "So, going twice," the auctioneer called out, the anticipation in the room reaching a fever pitch. Yo lunged forward, his hand snapping out to grab her wrist. Young-ho Yo's hand clamped around Carolyn's wrist like a midnight blue steel vice, the sheer physical force of his panic threatening to snap her bones. But the apex predator of the digital underworld was exactly 1 millisecond too late. Her index finger had already struck the glass, sending the final override cascading into the void. "Say sold!" The mahogany hammer cracked against the wooden podium with the deafening finality of a gunshot. Down in the pristine, halogen-lit hall, a wave of polite, oblivious applause erupted from the Chicago elite. The record-breaking transaction was ostensibly complete, but up in the shadowed isolation of the VIP balcony, the true detonation ripped through the silence. There was no explosion, no smoke, no shattered glass. Where the destruction of a billion-dollar empire happened entirely in the agonizingly quiet glow of a liquid crystal display. Yo's sleek, matte black smartwatch emitted a sharp, dying electronic whine. The screen flashed a violent terminal red before projecting a stark international seizure seal. Across the globe, thousands of heavily encrypted offshore nodes were simultaneously drained. The syndicate's dark wealth vaporized and securely locked inside federal vaults. So the flawless steganographic ledger had been weaponized into a beacon, blasting every hidden transaction, extortion record, and shell corporation directly to the servers of Interpol and the SEC. Yo froze, the breath leaving his lungs in a ragged, hollow hiss. The terrifying aura of absolute control that had radiated from him all night completely evaporated. He stared at the dead screen on his wrist, then slowly raised his dark eyes to meet Carolyn's. She did not shrink back from his bruising grip. The crushing weight of her disgraced past, the agonizing debt, and the paralyzing fear that had tethered her to this chair were entirely gone. She was the architect of his ruin, sitting perfectly calm in her emerald blazer. "You just bought a virus," she whispered, her voice steady and razor-sharp over the distant applause. The deal was dead. Down by the heavy velvet drapes, Steve J. Jones pressed a trembling hand to his earpiece. The corrupt auction director's face drained of all color as frantic security chatter confirmed the flashing lights of federal vehicles silently swarming the building's perimeter. The weak joint had finally snapped, his prestigious legacy turning to ash before his very eyes. Yo slowly released Carolyn's wrist, stepping back as if the very air around her had become toxic. Without his invisible digital fortress, the terrifying underboss was suddenly reduced to just a panicked man trapped in a high-rise. The illusion of his omnipotence shattered so completely that his bespoke, intimidating velvet tuxedo suddenly looked 2 sizes too big, hanging loosely off the frame of a ghost whose entire empire had just been erased by a single keystroke. 6 months after the mahogany hammer fell in Chicago, the air in the high-altitude boardroom was crisp, flooded with the brilliant, uncompromising light of a Tuesday morning. Carolyn C. Ryan stood at the head of a massive glass table, looking out over the sprawling city skyline. The heavy, suffocating scent of aged bourbon and cold ozone was a distant memory, replaced by the sharp, clean hum of secure servers. She was no longer a ghost haunting the unlisted basements of the art appraisal circuit, drowning in the grayscale ruins of her father's debts. She was a fortress. The fallout from the auction had been a masterpiece of its own. When international authorities swarmed the gala, Steve J. Jones's pristine legacy shattered into a million irredeemable pieces. His crooked bow tie, the last image of his crumbling empire. Young-ho Yo, the tech-savvy underboss who had tried to weaponize her brilliant mind, was now locked in a federal black site, completely severed from the digital realm he once ruled. And the billion-dollar steganographic ledger had not only exposed his ghost army, but had exonerated Carolyn in the process. The archaic mainframe language she had used to detonate the virus provided the exact forensic signature needed to prove her original frame job, clearing her name with clinical, undeniable precision. Now her fingers traced the smooth edge of the boardroom table as she addressed the team of elite cybersecurity architects sitting before her. They were looking at a glowing projection of a new financial network, a sprawling, complex architecture of code. But this time, Carolyn wasn't hunting for a hidden Trojan or a corrupted pixel. She was designing the foundation. She had built her new firm from the ashes of her exile, dedicated to constructing digital ecosystems that mirrored the ancient load-bearing structures of the physical world. She taught her team that true security wasn't rigid, when it was designed to flex under the crushing pressure of a modern digital siege without ever breaking. She knew exactly how the predators of the underworld operated, how they searched for the microscopic weak joints in a system, because she had looked the devil in the eye and dismantled his empire from the inside out. As she swiped a finger across her transparent tablet, locking the new, impenetrable encryption into place, the blue light reflected in her sharp, analytical eyes. So she was no longer a victim of the invisible war beneath the canvas. Carolyn had become the ultimate soldier of the digital underworld, and the fortresses she built would never fall,